Welcome. We're going to be taking a look at the psychodynamic approach in this session. So what we'll cover specifically in this session is an introduction to the psychodynamic approach, and then we'll be doing an overview of the id, ego, and superego. So we'll just begin with the specification for the psychodynamic approach, and as you can see there, it includes a number of things: the role of the unconscious, the structure of personality, defense mechanisms, and psychosexual stages. And like I said in the overview of what we'll be doing, and just to highlight on the specification, what we're going to be looking at specifically in today's session is the structure of personality, that is id, ego, and superego. So you can see all of those terms are actually named on the specification. So we'll begin with what you already know. So we've got some terms we need to define: id, ego, superego, and the man himself, Sigmund Freud. So there's space there in your work booklet just for you to write down what you already know about these things. So let's get those definitions in. So the id. So the id is that part of your personality. We often conceptualize it as being somewhat like the devil on your shoulder. So it's very much concerned with kind of self-gratification, and it wants things now. Now the id is the part of your personality that you're actually born with. So that's to say it's an innate part of your personality. And we'd often refer to the id as being the pleasure principle. Now the ego, sometimes we kind of view the ego as being a bit like a referee in a boxing match, if the boxing match was taking place between the id and the superego, because it has to tame those kind of innate selfish demands of the id and also to balance those moral demands of the superego. So your ego development happens around 2 to 4 years of age, and it's governed by the reality principle. That's to say what's happening in the real world. So the superego, very much the angel on your shoulder here, and that's the part of your personality that's concerned with morality, and it gives you that sense of morality, which is right and wrong. So it develops during the phallic stage of development, so around 4 to 5 years of age, and we often refer to the superego as the morality principle. And what about Sigmund Freud himself? Well, Sigmund Freud is the father of the psychodynamic approach. So although he's not named on the specification, he is the person that basically came up with this approach. And fundamentally, Freud believed that early childhood experiences and unconscious drives motivate our behaviour. And of course, he also came up with what we've just discussed, which is the tripartite theory of personality. That's the id, ego, and superego. When we think about personality and the psyche in respect to what it looks like, we've got this tripartite, this three-part personality, Freud said. Now, we often use this analogy of scales to consider where the id, ego, and superego might be located on these scales. So a quick job for you is on question 2, on those scales, can you place the id, ego, and superego in the correct place? All right, here we have it. Now, it doesn't so much matter which side you've got the id and the superego on. The key thing here is that you've got the ego in the middle. Because remember, like we said previously, in terms of your personality, it's the ego part of you that has to manage the selfish demands of the id on one hand with the moral demands of the superego on the other hand. We're going to think a little bit about how this structure of personality, that's to say the id, ego, and superego, might work in practice. And I'd like you to recall, and there's space in your booklet for you to do this, a time in your life where you've felt conflicted. So think of a time where your id wanted something, but maybe you felt guilty about it, and then ultimately how it was that your ego was able to manage that situation. Right, now I'm going to give you a scenario that I'd like you to work with, and this is about Rosie. So Rosie's found a wallet on the bus, and in the wallet there is £50, let's say 5 £10 notes. What I would like you to fill in your booklet is what the different parts of her personality are telling her. So what's her id saying to her? What's her superego saying? And ultimately, what does the ego perhaps decide to do? Okay, I'm not sure what you got, but I'm going to talk you through how I view the id, ego, and superego in Rose's scenario, so the 50 quid on the bus. So I think the id might say something along the lines of, take the money, you can use it to buy those new shoes you wanted. Remember, the fundamental thing about the id is it's not concerned with consequences, and it's very much selfish in its desires. The superego, morality principle here, remember, sense of right and wrong, is going to say, you know, hand it in, it doesn't belong to you, and it's going to make her feel that incredible sense of guilt should she dare to take the money. So ultimately, how does the ego manage the demands between the id saying, take the money, buy the shoes, and the superego saying, give it back, you know, it doesn't belong to you? It's going to come to some kind of compromise. So the decision that Rosie's going to make in this situation is she's going to keep 10 quid and she's going to hand the wallet into the driver. So it's not going to make her feel so guilty from the superego because it's only £10 out of 50, and her id's going to be satisfied because it got 10 quid. Okay, now we're going to have a go at a quick application activity, just applying some of the key terminology about id, ego, and superego. So as you can see, I've put a chunk of text here about the psychodynamic approach, and there are 6 numbers. Now, in your booklet, you will find you also have 6 numbers, and your job is simply to decide what the missing key term is for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So pause the video while you take a little bit of time just to figure that out. Okay, let's just run through the answers for that. So Freud believed that our unconscious and, number 1, early childhood experience were the driving force behind our behaviour. He saw our personality, that's number 2, as being divided into 3 parts. Remember, that's why it's called tripartite, because it's 3 parts. The id, ego, and superego, that's going to be number 3. The id was our selfish drive and acts on the pleasure principle, that's number 4. In opposition to this is the superego, which develops during the 5 phallic stage. This is concerned with the morality principle. Managing the demands of the id and the superego is the ego, which operates on the number 6 reality principle. Great work there. I hope you enjoyed that overview of the id, ego, and superego and the psychodynamic approach.